candidate or as an appointee to a board or as someone who's active in an organization of some kind. That's really the goal. And yes, I've heard that from lots of women. And I did share, as I know you noticed in the book, lessons of women, for instance, Cecile Richards, who have not been elected officials, but have had just, immeasurable importance on behalf of women in the public arena.
Yeah, I love a lot of the stories in the book. As a Chicagoan, I also appreciate the female Chicago politicians who are in the book.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I thought about was, and I think it's reflected in the book, is I didn't only want to write about women who were on the national scene or women who are, like celebrities or something like that, because there are, for instance, 500,000 public offices in the United States. And so and every single one of them is important, right? So I wanted to communicate the stories and the ideas of women who are active locally or in their states or even in their neighborhoods, and just sort of say, here's something great that Monica did. You can do this too. And of course, I have a bent towards Chicago. So Chicago's disproportionately represented, as you would say.
As it should be, as it is in this podcast as well.
Mm-hmm.
I love the stories about Toni Preckwinkle. She lives in my neighborhood, and so I have run into her in the grocery store numerous times, and she's just a wonderful human being. So it's always...
Well, Toni's a perfect example, as you know, of the kind of, opportunity that every woman has. I mean, she was active as a young woman. She went to college. She did great things in college. She became a teacher, which is, of course, a common profession for many women. And then she said, I can do more, and here she is. I believe Cook County is the 19th largest government in the whole country. I mean, it's huge. And so, yeah, I think Toni, by way of example, is a great one, and also from the standpoint that she kept trying, right?
Mm-hmm.
She talks in the book about, I tell her story about running for alderman several times until she won. She persisted, right?
Yeah. All right. Sophie, you want to take us out of just talking about Chicago? Because I think the two of us could just talk about Chicago all day.
Sure. We could sort of move from Chicago to sort of the rural-urban divide. Since a lot of your experience has been in Chicago, do you think women in like rural or suburban areas face different electoral challenges than women in cities like Chicago?
Good question. The mechanics of imagining a race and planning it are the same, right? You have to figure out what you're going to run for, what your platform is, where you think your voters are, what kind of message you want to put forth. So the sort of elements of running a successful campaign are the same. What differs, obviously, is, for instance, in an urban area, the likelihood is that your voters are much more concentrated, so you can walk from door to door, and maybe in the rural area you have to drive. Now, that's a sort of simplistic example of the difference, but I think that that's one part of it, that the practical experience is different and you have to prepare for that. The other difference is that, the sort of key policy issues may differ. There are issues that confront a lot of rural communities that are different from those that confront a lot of urban communities. But on the other hand, a lot of them are the same. Women typically run for office wherever they are because they care about, sort of everyday issues that relate to them and their families. So it's education and healthcare services and employment opportunities. And so the particulars of those may differ from, for that matter, from a big city to a small city, but the nature of the issues is different. And I would argue, for instance, that take the issue of childcare. Well, whether you're raising your children in a rural community or an urban community, you want to make sure there's sound policy on that issue, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I guess the other thing I would point out is if you're running for a state office versus a local office or a federal office, then many of the concerns that you're going to have to address are common across geography. So I would tell you that in my own experience traveling around the country and talking about the book and doing, book signings and that kind of thing, the enthusiasm I've seen for women who want to run is uniform, whether rural or urban. And I'm guessing that other people who are active in this arena would say the same thing. So that's really great.
Yeah, I wonder if it's actually easier to find sort of small offices to start with in more rural areas. We, in our previous segment, we talked to a woman who had just won her race to be a township supervisor. And when I think about that kind of thing, it's hard to imagine in a big city sort of where you even start, because
Right.
even the position of alderman is such a huge number of constituents that you would be serving.
Right.
And in some cities like Chicago, there's not an elected school board. Even if there were, and it was a citywide position, that would still be a sort of really powerful position. So I think that that's one thing, too, that may be a little bit different between sort of urban and rural politics.
It is different in the sense that, the competition might be greater in the urban area and the size of the office is larger. But I think, so that's true. But I think that a smart woman who cares about her community and wants to, for instance, be an alderman in the city of Chicago, would be smart not to start off by saying, hey, gee whiz, I'm raising my hand, I want to run for alderman. But she would have started out by becoming active in the community. And there are hundreds of ways to do that. And people are always looking for volunteers, whatever the community project is. And by virtue of that activity, she would then develop a name and a reputation and a network of contacts so that when she decided, say, to run for alderman, she wouldn't be doing it in a vacuum. She would be saying, gee whiz, I've been active in Hyde Park for the last 20 years, and I know a lot of people, and I know what the community cares about. A good example of that, for instance, in Hyde Park, in your neighborhood, would be Barbara Flynn Curry, who has been the state rep there for many years. She started out in the Neighborhood League of Women Voters and, developed her knowledge and her relationships and her commitment by doing that, so that by the time she ran for state rep, it was, gee whiz, why didn't we all think of this sooner, So I think you're right, but it is also, as I've said, and in fact, that starting out at a very grassroots level is what most women do. And therefore, by the time they get to run for alderman, they're superbly qualified.
Yeah, and that is one of the pieces of advice that I noticed in the book that I thought was relevant to nearly all careers is to sort of, go to the power players and say, I'm willing to do anything. I'm great at organizing. Put me to work. I love going to meetings. Send me to meetings. Or, well, I can fundraise.
Well, it's just, I have to say, that it was honestly, I grew up in New York. My husband and I came to Chicago knowing almost nobody with no jobs, with all our belongings in the backseat of a Toyota Corolla. And, right away, I was interested in women's issues, and I went to the local women's center and I volunteered. And then I had this idea for a project, and they said, sure, go ahead and do it, and we'll help you out with it. So I do think that there is that opportunity. And, when you initiate in that way, people appreciate your commitment, right? As opposed to waiting to be asked, for instance. They look at you and they say, gee whiz, she really cares. Let's pay more attention to her. Let's invite her to this meeting. Let's ask her to chair a committee, whatever it is.
So I think we've noticed a shift in the past year, let's say, with more and more women interested in running for office, getting themselves on the ballot. your book was published in 2013, and you say a lot of it came out of sort of the 2008 primary, thinking about it in that way. Are there any lessons that you think have changed at all? Any advice that is different now than even a year ago with the number of women running or the political climate being different?
It's absolutely different, and only in the most wonderful way, as we all know, because it's just been, in every media you could possibly look at. Women, tens and tens of thousands of women have decided to be active in public affairs in a way that they hadn't been. And a significant subset of them have decided that they also want to run for office. So, it began, I think, really kind of mobilized around the Women's March in January, but, that's continued unabated. And what I hear from my colleagues who run organizations that train women to run is, they've just had thousands more women apply for these sessions than they had even the year before. So I think there's no doubt that the climate has changed. What it takes to run a good campaign, I don't think has changed much from 2013. So the advice, I believe, is sound, but the opportunity is greater because people are interested in this. More people are doing it. It also means the competition is greater, but that's a good thing because people then will work hard and even harder to run. I think the other kind of unknown piece is the first step is to acknowledge to yourself, this is something I want to do. And an important second step is training, right? And learning how to do it. And then the third step is, as we just discussed, finding an office that makes sense to run for and an opening to actually do that. And along with that, making the decision that you personally have the wherewithal, emotionally and intellectually to run, which is quite different than being trained to run. So, that's, I think, the biggie at the moment. But, the sort of math would suggest that because there's so many more women interested, there will be so many more women running. And certainly, for instance, what we saw in Virginia a couple of weeks ago is evidence of that.
You mentioned this idea of sort of figuring out your own personality, and I just wanted to call out for those who haven't read the book that you have a whole chapter called Your Personality Self-Test, which I found extremely helpful in thinking through, lots of questions and examples of those, different women who are in politics, who've won public office, how their personality types sort of mesh with these different questions that you ask. And so I would encourage anyone who's thinking, it helped me sort of really take a good look at myself and whether running for office at some point might make sense for my personality.
Yeah, it is. I want to say one thing about it. One is it is really important to do that self-assessment. And as you say, I talk a lot about why that is and what that consists of in the book. But it's also important to recognize that, one of the wonderful things about women who are running for office today is the diversity of women. And they're both diverse by, family background and race and ethnicity, and by type of personality, right? So it isn't only one type of woman who is successfully running for office these days. So the assessment, for instance, that's in the book is really a tool. And then you figure out, and I talk a bit about this, how to be a leader in your own style, how to be a public speaker in your own style. And I've seen lots of examples of that, and I'm very much at pains, so to speak, to encourage women of a variety of types to think about this, because there are different ways of going about it that can be successful.
Yeah, and I think, I've been outspoken in social media and on this podcast about having been treated for anxiety. And I think that before I had gone through treatment, my sort of answer to those questions would have been completely different. I don't think that even thinking about running for office or hosting a podcast for that matter is something that I could have done But after going through treatment and medication, it's much easier to say, oh, right, this is the personality that was sort of lurking behind the mental illness. So